on to our next presentation of the morning with Dr. Tracey Myers. Tracey has been very important to me, personally and professionally. She's been my mentor through the Insight Yoga Institute since 2014. And she's just a phenomenal practitioner, physician, and friend. Tracey Myers is a licensed clinical psychologist in the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, and a senior facilitator at Studio B. Tracey also works at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, a legal assistance program serving lawyers, judges, and law students. Prior to joining LCL, she worked for the State of Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction, where she spent over 16 years working in inpatient and outpatient mental health settings. Dr. Myers has a strong commitment to integrative medicine for mental health and wellness and leads mindfulness and yoga programs for groups, individuals, and professionals in the workplace. In addition to her background in psychology, she is also an advanced yoga teacher, certified yoga therapist, and meditation teacher. Tracey has authored several publications around integrative medicine, positive behavioral support treatment for different mental health conditions, and developing collaborative relationships in healthcare settings. Her new book, Yin Yoga Therapy and Mental Health, will be released in June of this year and is an extensive guide to utilizing yoga and meditation to support mental health and well-being. Please welcome Dr. Tracey Myers.
So thank you all. Thank you to Allied Health Services for having us come, and Jen and the team at Studio B that supports us. I feel very much akin to the work you do. Spent most of my career working in mental health, brain injury, rehabilitation, nursing homes, et cetera. So I have deep appreciation for all the work you do. I've been in the trenches with you and really appreciate some of the demands and challenges. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of burnout, and then something that's even a little bit more, I think, insidious, which is compassion fatigue. I know we were speaking about that earlier around what is the impact when we start to not see the person in front of us as similar to ourselves. So we're going to talk about compassion fatigue today. And then also, how do we recognize the signs of distress in ourselves and others? All of you and all of the people, all of the staff that you work with, these are people that are veterans in a way, right? And so we don't often even notice those subtle signs when someone's starting to struggle, when our work is slipping in some ways. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, both for people around us and for ourselves too. You did the app in the beginning today, the checklist. I'm going to talk more about that importance of doing a self-assessment to really check in to how you're doing, because we can go for large swaths of time on autopilot, just doing our job, just getting up and doing it, and we're not really always checking in and knowing, if we're struggling, if we're having a hard time. And then talk about enhancing well-being. So this is like this kickoff. And so I'm excited to talk about some of the strategies that can be supported by using the platform and some additional ones to consider. And then we're going to finish by talking about self-compassion, which is really the antidote to compassion fatigue and burnout, is how can we begin to turn toward ourselves with kindness, even when we're really struggling. So I definitely relate to being in some of the same hospital settings and outpatient settings as many of you. And when I first started learning mindfulness, I kind of had two different hats. I'd have my neuropsychology hat on during the day, and then I would teach at a yoga studio at night. And, so I never really integrated my two worlds. So I had my clinical world and then my kind of spiritual path. But I decided after I finished my 8-week training in mindfulness-based stress reduction to teach at a group for the inpatient population I was working with. And the first group was a disaster. Like everything that could go wrong, nothing that like looked like what I learned in my practicum happened. I had 2 patients walk out in the middle of group. One patient wouldn't sit down and she kept circling around and around the room. I had a staff person distracted on their phone. It was a mess. And I was like, this is terrible. I'm not going to do this again. But then I saw one of the patients the next day and they're like, hey, you're the yoga lady. And I was like, oh. And they said, I like that. So I was like really surprised. And I asked them, what did they like? Oh, I felt good, got to move my body. A couple days later, I saw one of the staff people. She's like, I hope you do that group again. I really liked it. I was like, So I ran it again. It was equally messy, noisy. One patient in the middle of the group started, kind of getting agitated, had to leave. So it was not a perfect 8-week program. I laugh because it was actually like the opposite of, all the things was supposed to be quiet and calm. But what I learned from that was I was able to reach some of the clients, or more importantly, they were able to find some stillness, something that felt supportive to them. And the staff actually were harder to get on board. The clients began to really like some of the practices, but the staff were pretty suspicious. And it took a long time to have them. So often I'd have them come in. I'd say, come with the patients, come in. And they kind of sit on the outside, or they would get on their phones and be like, I don't want to do this. But little by little, 1 or 2 staff, not all, would start to participate. And I'd see them do it with the clients on off shifts. They'd be like, hey, let's do a little bit more of the mindfulness. So it was a small, steady increase. And over time, we started doing things for staff only. So the staff could start to buy in and get a sense for themselves of why it was important. And what we saw was that culture shift that Siobhan and Sarah Jane have been talking about, this idea that if we start with small steps, a little short practice, getting the clients involved, and a few people start to feel the benefit, it starts to spread. We ended up having a yoga program that staff could sign up to become a certified yoga instructor inpatient. And we had a huge response. And we saw that when we offered trainings for the staff in mindfulness, that they started to become more interested and more willing to do it with the patients. So I'm realistic as I'm thinking about you guys starting this program, that you may have mixed reactions sometimes from staff. You may get resistance. You may get some people that are really interested. It's going to be the whole range, but never underestimate the impact it might have. Even if you don't know right away, you might be reaching someone who isn't saying much in a meeting, or may look disinterested, but is actually going home and practicing with their teenager at night. So it doesn't have to look perfect. People may be noisy. You're going to have interruptions sometimes when you're supposed to be quiet and sitting in practice, and it's okay. And I've made every mistake possible when leading practices in busy settings, and it's okay. So just letting yourself off the hook, it doesn't have to be perfect. And just know that making that effort and that sincere ability to connect with people is going to make a difference. So anyway, I will probably intersperse some mistakes I've made and some of the benefits along with those during this presentation today. All right. Oops, if I could go the right way, that would be good. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about professional quality of life. When we think about going into clinical work, healthcare work, most people, 99% of people say, I want to go in to help people. I want to have meaningful work. I want to do something that makes a difference. And when we're able to do that feeling when we've helped someone, it's called professional satisfaction, right? Or compassion satisfaction. I want to help someone. I did help someone. They feel good. And in return, I feel good, right? That ability to feel compassion and to know we're making a difference. So that can sustain us for a long time, right? When we feel good, even if the work is extremely difficult. We think about hospice work or work with really difficult populations. When we know we're making a difference, we can tolerate a lot. But what happens when we're trying to help someone or a system or a group of people, and we're not feeling like we're making a difference, or it's so overwhelming that it's like a drop in the bucket and it doesn't seem to matter what we do? then we're more susceptible to something called compassion fatigue, where my altruistic, my desire to help other people is getting eroded. And my view starts to change of my meaningful purpose in life, right? I no longer feel as connected to the work I'm doing or the people in front of me. And it can happen subtly over time. It's not like it usually, one day you wake up and say, I'm just burned out and I have compassion fatigue. I no longer care. It's more insidious. It just starts slowly. Working in inpatient settings, I would see examples, especially for a state hospital, we had employees that were employed for 30 or 40 years, right? Till they could retire. And you'd see over time this erosion in people that were good people, good staff, good nurses, good physicians, good psychologists that over time got worn down in some ways. And small things like a patient could be yelling or screaming and they'd be ignoring the patient and they'd be right in front of them. And from an outside perspective, I'd be like, well, that's terrible. But when you could see that they were glazed over, that there was something that was hardened or overwhelmed in their own system, it makes more sense. So I want to think about this not judgmentally, because we can judge. I could have judged that healthcare provider and said, oh, they don't care anymore, they're not good at their job, I'm going to report them. Or we can start to think about, wow, what's happening inside that creates this compassion fatigue? So that's what I'm really interested in. And also, what are the remedies? How can we enhance that so we have more compassion satisfaction? So one of the challenges is that compassion fatigue not only affects how we do our work, but how we feel inside. And so people that have more compassion fatigue are more prone to depression, anxiety, and sometimes PTSD, real traumatic responses, especially people that have worked in environments where there's repeated violence or exposure to trauma, right? So Siobhan talked really specifically about burnout, and I want to go the next step and talk about what is compassion fatigue itself. So burnout involves the environment. And in fact, when you change an environment, for example, you go on vacation and you're like, I don't care about work at all. I feel great. You feel restored, renewed, like, all is okay. Burnout is very specific. If the environment is removed, if the stress is removed, I feel better. When we get into the compassion fatigue terrain, it changes how we see the world, and we don't feel better when we go on vacation. Something has shifted inside of us, and it takes more than just the environment to change to restore ourselves. It sometimes requires some individual work. It requires doing practices sometimes, like we're going to be doing today. I'll be doing a little compassion fatigue practice, but also doing ongoing meditation, sometimes even going to therapy or counseling, because something has shifted inside of us that needs addressing. One of the pieces I want to say, and Siobhan talked about this as well, is that one of the ways to prevent compassion fatigue, even in very difficult environments like you all worked in, like I work in, is support around each other. And you probably know this on your teams that function well. Think about your teams that function well that you supervise. These teams tend to have a sense of camaraderie, like we're all in this together. I've worked in inpatient teams with the most violent, aggressive patients, like the most difficult. But if the team functioned well, we did fine. There wasn't compassion fatigue. Like we were able to use humor and all sorts of things, but we knew everyone had each other's backs. When I worked on units where there was dissension, finger pointing, lack of investment, you can name a bunch of different things that happened. Typically then you'd see the compassion fatigue really start to rise. People were not happy, more infighting, and less sense of camaraderie. And then the stress would get to people. The patients would get to people. So part of the compassion practices are not only about our individual well-being, but also the group itself. So it's a beautiful balance between doing our own work and supporting one another. And that's really the theme of my talk. So of course we know that under the pandemic conditions, there's a rising incidence of compassion fatigue in healthcare professionals. People are leaving, the Great Resignation, right? You guys have experienced losses, job losses, people leaving very much like the rest of the country has. So I want to start to think about what are the actual signs. I'm a really practical person, and I want to really be specific when thinking about what do we notice in ourselves and or our colleagues when we start to recognize we're not feeling that great. It seems obvious, but often, again, we go on autopilot where we don't even recognize in ourselves and sometimes even in our colleagues that we're hurting, that we're struggling. And because we've been virtual or behind masks or separated and we don't gather as much, we don't eat together as much, these opportunities to check in and say, hey, how are you doing, have diminished somewhat. So these are some of the signs of compassion fatigue and some of the resulting emotional issues. So absenteeism, irritability, right? When your usually good-natured friend starts to be short and irritable, or irritable with the clients. I would see that a lot as one of those indicators. Indecisiveness, decreased productivity and efficiency, which is, maybe obvious. Avoidance. This is a big one. Do we start to avoid situations that are hard? Like, I'm not working with that patient today because I can't take it anymore. They're so whatever, XYZ. And again, I'm not saying this judgmentally, but just more thoughtfully. Like, are there situations, people, coworkers that you start to avoid because it's too painful in some way? Lack of diligence in performance, overwhelmed, questioning competence. Like, should I even be doing this? I went into this field for this, and now I feel like I'm just pushing pills, for example. And feeling trapped, feeling stuck. That's the number one thing when I work with professionals is this idea when they're feeling a lot of compassion fatigue. I talk about, well, what are your choices and options? When we're under stress and when we're suffering from compassion fatigue, we get tunnel vision, and it's hard to even see that there are other options, right? We feel really stuck, like there's no other way but this. And a couple more. I wanted to also really highlight on this slide the sense of physical complaints. This is another area. Siobhan had done that survey, how many people sleep well, right? And we might ask the same question about like tension. How many people have tension in their neck and shoulders, right? Or headaches. So sometimes these are these physical symptoms that are a result of the stress response in the body. Of course, I'm talking to people that know the mind-body connection. But these are, if you take this together with a sense of avoidance, with a sense of irritability, with a sense of anxiety coupled together, it starts to form a picture of how you're really doing in the here and now. So first we have to pause and really figure out, how am I doing, right? I'm a big fan. As a psychologist, a lot of our training, especially in the early years, is around psychological testing. So we really don't know where we are or how we're doing or if what we're doing is helping until we measure. So I'm so thrilled about the pre-test you did to look at, like, how am I doing? How's my stress? How's my sleep? How's my mood? And getting that baseline data, then we actually can tell, A, do I need more help? And B, if I do an intervention, is it going to make a difference, right? So pre-test, post-test, doing something before an intervention and after. But truthfully, when I do measures with people, very much like some of the ones you took today, you took something called the Perceived Stress Test, the PSS, and people are usually surprised how high they score on it. And we can function with very high levels of stress without even realizing it. But there's something about the number. It's kind of like the scale, which I'm not a big fan of weighing myself, but there's something sobering and honest about getting the data. And not to judge ourselves, but to recognize, it's actually a moment of compassion of like, oh, wow, like my stress level is really high. And when we recognize it, that actually can be the turning point. So that data is not only helpful to other people, but for yourself to recognize, like, wow, this is hard. This has taken a toll on me. And that's the beginning stage to make change. So we assess ourselves to see where we might need some additional supports. And then a self-care plan individually, and also, for the greater group. So we'll talk about the individual and the group. And then how do we integrate these? Again, I'm a very practical person, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how you integrate it in work settings. Can you do something in 2 to 3 minutes with your staff when it's noisy and people are, banging on the doors for support, right? Like, how can we integrate these practices so that they make a difference for you and for your workplace? So the stress assessment, there are many different tools. One of the easiest ones, and you might do this with your staff, you in leadership that are going to be kind of responsible for your team, there's a simple scale called the SUDS, Subjective Units of Distress. You don't have to know that part. It's either a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 or 0 to 100. You can scale it. But basically, have people in the beginning, before they practice or do a practice, on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed are you right now? Very simple, right? With 1 being totally relaxed and 10 being like, I'm so stressed. They don't have to share it. They can write it down and then have them do the practice. And then afterward, ask them to check back in. And then you might even ask, did anyone notice a difference, right? And it's pretty potent when you can see, even after 2 minutes of breathing, like Sarah Jane led that resonant breathing. So 2 or 3 minutes of doing that, you'll notice people's SUD scales can go down from 2 to 5 to 10 points sometimes. So you get a direct sense of your stress level, but also how even a simple pause and doing some breathing can make a difference. And that's how we hook in people that may not be as open to some of the practices or don't know that much about them. So we want to do a little bit of assessment. I really encourage you to do that frequently, even before and after each practice you lead, very quickly, so that you start to get in that habit. All right, so we assess and then we decide, all right, what is our self-kit? Now, you guys are going to have a platform to really customize and pick some of the things that you really want to do. And we'll also structure that for you, so you'll have some pathways. You don't have to come up with it all on your own. But I want to highlight these areas because this is really crucial in terms of moving from compassion fatigue back into compassion satisfaction. So we don't want to bang our heads. We can feel like we're doing that sometimes when we're trying to actually reduce stress. It can increase stress. And some of you may have noticed that, in the beginning, when we start using self-care strategies like mindfulness, it can be even agitating. If you don't have to raise your hand, but you might have noticed when Sarah Jane was leading, like the mind got really distracted. I don't like that sound in the back of the room. I'm cold. Oh my gosh, I bet you I have like 17 emails. You can start to notice some of that reactivity, and that's okay. It actually takes some time for our nervous systems to settle. I'm going to talk about why it takes a little bit of time. So you can't do this wrong, even if you have all of those slightly hostile thoughts. I could be a really hostile meditator secretly. And it's not a problem, right? We can just, okay, that's actually my system trying to kind of work through some things. So I can kind of laugh at my inner dialogue sometimes because it can be very harsh. So one of the tasks, as you all are going to be getting some people on board, is to let people know that it's not indulgent. And it's really hard because self-care has this funny kind of reputation of like, oh, isn't that nice, self-care? Well, that's, how are we actually going to get our work done? That'd be nice to be able to do this, right? At the hospital I worked with, the frontline staff would feel hostile, openly hostile, if they knew that management was going to do a retreat or do self-care. They'd be like, well, isn't that nice that they're doing that? Or we're supposed to do this with the patients, but we're struggling. So we want to really help our staff understand that we know it's critical, and you're investing time and resources for them, so that it isn't just like a extra thing. We get it. This is critical to keep people in the jobs and help people feel better. So we want to think about self-care, and as you're designing your own, as you're looking at the platform and thinking about for yourselves, what practices are going to be important for you. In general, when we think about self-care, there are different domains, and I just want to point them out. We don't have to go through all of these at length today. But there are areas of self-care that you can address. We can talk about a physical, like the yoga practice, physical practice. We can talk about mindfulness or a spiritual practice. We can talk about social and connection. We can talk about psychological wellness. So these areas of self-care, we might really help our staff focus on one of them for the month, right? And so you don't have to approach all of them, but just understanding we're complicated beings, that we have many different parts of ourselves. If staff are feeling a little resistant around this idea of self-care, maybe you're going to steer them toward community, right? Maybe that's an area that they feel like, okay, well, that's not self-indulgent. That matters to me, right? So we want to find the language that's going to resonate with the people we're working with. And so sometimes mindfulness or self-care may not resonate initially, and you may be using different language or really focusing on the fact that we can create a compassionate workplace, or we can bring this home to our families. So this is often where I like to start, with thinking about our own friendship circles and our own communities. One of the things that so many of us are struggling with right now is the fact that we haven't had those communities together where we can get support. And in healthcare settings, the break room moments, the times in between, being able to grab a friend and go for a walk outside, like that diminished significantly. And with that, we lost part of that self-care. But I think about your inner circle and how important this is for our well-being. And we need to have people in our inner circle that are different, right? We need to have a prophet, a friend who tells you the truth, not what you necessarily want to hear, but says to you, you're full of shit, Tracey, like that's stupid, right? Not in a mean way, but kind of like telling you as it is, right? A cheerleader, someone who really wants to encourage you and says, you got it, right? A harasser, someone who just makes us laugh at ourselves. And finally, someone who is like a spiritual guide, a mentor, or someone who's on the same path that recognizes the importance of these things for meaning in life. And we need these different people. What's happened during the pandemic for many of us is we had that circle has shrunk, or it's just on Zoom, and we haven't had that like in-person connection. And that takes a toll. So maybe it's helping your staff even start to reinvigorate one or more of these people in their inner circle. Supervision is huge when you're working, and you all, I hope, with each other too, thinking about how can we support each other to create a workplace that is more receptive to practices and also can instill compassion, satisfaction. So I love this idea, and all of us need this too, right? We can get very comfortable no matter what level we are at in an organization. We can get comfortable sort of where we are, but I love this idea of having a coach, a teacher, a mentor, these different people in our own lives that can enhance what we're doing. And so as you guys are embarking on something new, Bill was talking about starting new, and it's not always easy. So I hope for you all too that you're interested in having someone that can support you in this role, your group leaders from Studio B, your peers that are leading different groups, to utilize each other, because that makes it fun. This doesn't have to be a grim practice. Sometimes meditation and yoga can feel kind of grim and really contained and quiet. And in our organizations, I think it's important to have fun, to be supportive of each other, and to use each other for a little bit of levity as well.